Good day. I'd like to talk in this blog about something very important, and that is our model for the treatment of Alzheimer's, which is officially called an etiological model for Alzheimer's. And let me give you a little bit of history on this. Etiology means the study of causes. And early in the 2000s, Dr. Upledger, my mentor, wrote a paper called an etiological model for autism. And he testified in front of Congress. And he wrote a paper, short little paper, to explain basically why autism can be impacted by craniosacral therapy and what aspects of the brain physiology is impacted by craniosacral treatment, really pointing out step by step a model that really explained the relationship between autism and craniosacral therapy. So similarly, I'm working on creating a model called an etiological model for Alzheimer's, looking at the commonality of causes, no matter how we conjecture the exact mechanism by which Alzheimer's is created, but the commonality of symptoms and a mechanism within the brain that explains this. So in a way, this is our theory to explain the results that we have been getting practically with craniosacral therapy. So here's the idea, is that our basic model is one of brain inflammation and flow of cerebrospinal fluid. And very simply put, what we're saying is that as cerebrospinal fluid is lowered as we get older and we're stricken with this disease, craniosacral therapy can reverse this blockage and shrinkage of volume and pump things up in the brain again. So that's the bottom line, is why we feel this works. Now, here's a little more of the detail. Let me break this down a little bit more. What we found is that generally, and we talk about this in basic craniosacral courses, is that there's always a circulation of cerebrospinal fluid in the body. At any one time, there's only about 120 milliliters, or 4 fluid ounces, of cerebrospinal fluid in the body, in the brain and the spinal cord. It's not a lot, but it circulates 5 to 6 times a day in normal adults. So this circulation is called replacement volume. And depending on the research, as I talk about in my book that we look at, we've been able to document that this normal turnover or flow of 5 to 6 times a day of 125 milliliters at any one time in the system basically pencils out to about 600 to 800 milliliters a day of turnover of fluid, almost a whole liter in a sense, which is quite a bit turnover of cerebrospinal fluid. And there's mechanisms within the brain and what's called the ventricles of the brain and a structure called the choroid plexus in the brain that actually manufactures this fluid on an ongoing basis. So all this is well and good. Now, what Dr. Upledger noticed in an article that he wrote for Massage Therapy magazine in early 2000 is that in middle-aged adults, whatever middle-aged means anymore, 60 or over, is that often the turnover of cerebrospinal fluid is less than a normal or maybe younger adult. And if you talk to many doctors and they look at brain scans, when people get older, they'll say, yeah, you know, it looks like your brain is shrinking a little bit. They can actually document by looking at the MRI. That's not a huge revelation, but in terms of people that deal with the senior community and doctors, that's something that they're not completely unaware of. Now, the story gets worse with Alzheimer's, and here's the key, is that when we did research, and my nurse practitioner friends did research on this, we found out in people with senile dementia, this turnover or flow of cerebrospinal fluid is even half that of a middle-aged adult, or about 75% less than a normal adult in terms of turnover of cerebrospinal fluid. So to put a number to that, for example, the turnover of cerebrospinal fluid in someone with Alzheimer's dementia might be 200 milliliters a day versus 600 to 800, or possibly as much as 75% less. And the result of this diminishment of cerebrospinal fluid means that the brain literally dries up, a little bit like a shrunken head. In my TED Talk, I showed a picture of an Alzheimer's brain and a normal brain. A normal brain looks full, but an Alzheimer's brain looks shrunken, a little bit like a walnut. So if you've ever seen scans of Alzheimer's patients that are advanced, you'll see this kind of shrunken head phenomenon. That's reflective of cerebrospinal fluid being diminished. And University of Rochester, that's done a lot of research in this glial system. Remember, I've spoken in prior blogs about the glial system, which means there's about 100 billion neurons in the head and about 100 billion glial cells or astrocytes that connect these. So think again of the neurons as Christmas tree lights, and the astrocytes or glial cells as the wires that connect them together. And also within this area, in the head, in this all this area of the head, there's about 400 miles of vascular supply. So think about this. This is a fairly miniature structure, but in this microstructure, all of that physiology is encoded or in place since birth. So as researchers at University of Rochester are suggesting, is if there's a diminishment of flow of cerebrospinal fluid, and if there was a way to increase that flow, then all of these accumulated toxins, which are reflective of the amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, which are kind of like the hallmark signature of Alzheimer's disease, could be kind of in a way worn away, like the way you would scrub a dish if there's a really hard black speck on it and get it out, or if you take your car through a car wash and there's some piece on it that's really hard, maybe you take the nozzle and concentrate it on that to get that really hard black spot out of the way. That's the idea of basically increasing the deposition or the flow of cerebrospinal fluid to wear away these deposits. So that's basically our theory, or our ecological model, that decreased flow of cerebrospinal fluid is a commonality. Whether, as we talked about with all these different symptoms of Alzheimer's, whether it's caused by inflammation, in my opinion, or toxicity like heavy metals, or even trauma, when there is an assault on the craniosacral system and the brain, and cerebrospinal fluid is diminished, if across the board, no matter what the causative effects are, if you can increase the flow of cerebrospinal fluid to near normal levels, then you're going to be able to start to see the results. And that's one reason I think that we're getting results so relatively quickly, that with a few weeks of craniosacral therapy, we're actually seeing some noticeable results. And as I'm saying, to be adjunctive about it, if you can add in implementation of things like diet, exercise, deeper rest, meditation, other things that calm the system and help clear that system in addition to craniosacral therapy, then you have something that you can really get leverage to really stack the cards in your favor. But it's as if the craniosacral treatment is the first thing to start to actually get results. Then you can build on that to grow the momentum. So that's where we're very, very excited about that. That is, in brief, a summary, very simply, of our theory. Decreased cerebrospinal fluid flow brought on by inflammation or any number of factors. Craniosacral therapy helps increase the flow to near normal levels. That clears the toxins out of the brain. And because of that, you start to see the results. It's very simple, but that's our model. And look in further days for our official publishing of that ecological model for Alzheimer's and dementia, with all the citations and all the science around it. So thanks for letting me share that with you. Very excited as we're educating the medical community and neurological community, scientific community, senior care community on this model, and then have them test it out practically. So thanks for listening.